to fix blockages.
Is there any other municipality that's
Not yet. So we're going to use this as an example of what other municipalities are doing.
have you got any evidence
You only have the revolutionaries in so-called in other parts of the country who think toilet paper is a bad idea.
Ready when you are.
Start?
A minute, please. Just a minute. Firstly, welcome all of you here on behalf of Ndifuna Ukwazi. Today, we are here by Shula Max. So I will do introduction about her. So I will just briefly explain about her. I'm Swiso, by the way, Sitwana. I'm the fellow here. So I will talk about Shula Max. Shula Max is the one of the greatest African historian in South Africa. In 1963 to 76, she was a lecturer in the South African Institution of Commonwealth Students. She supported the liberation of movement in South Africa. She was active in the anti-apartheid movement and supported the civil society, Democratic South Africa. She is the founder of Friends of the TAC in Britain. She responded on Deputy Minister Peter Mulder on his statement that was made in Parliament on the issue of the land of South Africa on February 16. She even challenged the discussion about the statement statement that made by Peter Mulder on SAFM. So that's me. Thank you.
Again, we want to thank Shula. She is an important friend of everyone here in the room. And what we're going to do, the format we're going to take is tomorrow she's leaving for home, and she's taken out time after her credit card was stolen, or not stolen, it was misused from abroad. So it wasn't a local.
No, it was local. It was my local credit card.
A local credit card was misused, so she had to run around to the banks. So if she's a little frazzled, as I would be, you can forgive her this time. Shula is going to tell us a little bit for about 5-10 minutes, and then I'm going to ask her some difficult questions. And then I hope, and they will be short to the point so that she can get most of the time to speak. And then we'll open up the question for discussion. Sorry, I was standing, I'm Zaki. Before we do that, I'm just going to ask people just to go around, just to introduce themselves so that Shula gets an idea of who's here and what they're doing.
I'm Annalise, and do you want to say what I do?
Yeah.
I'm a clinical psychologist.
Excellent.
I'm Linda Gilfillan, I'm a fiction editor.
Robin Gilfillan, a retired publisher.
Jacques van Herden, I work for the NU Fellowship Program.
Nada Kornberg, I run Internet South African History Online.
Rachel Sandwell, I volunteer at South African History Online.
Omar Bash from South African History.
I'm one of the fellows.
I'm Cornelia Mutwala from the Social Justice Coalition.
From the Social Justice Coalition.
Cindy Mukhaza from one of TAC's fundraising agents.
So go this way and then we go back.
Jonathan Winters, currently a student at UCT, visiting from California, and an activist
and a good historian.
Bianca Kaminga, doing my PhD at the Institute for Humanities in Africa. Okay, I'm not going to go to
So Nwabi is one point from SJC /TAC.
Omar from Ndifuna Ukwazi. Liam from Open Charter Street and also HT Street.
Chris Huster, I'm here at Ndifuna Ukwazi.
Who's in the queue from SJC? I'm Lutan Dogorka from SJC.
This is Marcel Tuataba from SJC. My name is Sarah Waldromela. Member of SJC and member of ANC.
Exactly. Lily the veteran ambassador from SJC.
Zenande from University.
So Bruce Bagger, I'm studying at UCT and I'm from Ndifuna Ukwazi and Open Charter Street.
Welcome again at SJC.
Abongile, SJC. This is level 10 volunteer, SJC, OSS.
And you are? Tell everyone, don't be rude.
Jack from Community Media Trust.
Thanks, Shula.
Right, so it's over to me now. Yeah. I better stand up because I don't think you'll hear me if I'm sitting down there. Well, as you've heard, I'm a historian. I've been a historian for more than 50 years, so before most people. And I'm interested in this title, A Life in History, because my life has been in history. I've been a professional historian ever since even before I got my PhD, I got an appointment at the School of Oriental and African Studies at a very exciting time in the development of African history. It was the 1960s, and for the first time, there was a recognition that there was such a thing as African history. When I first started at the School of Oriental and African Studies, people all thought, particularly here, that I was an anthropologist. Africans have anthropologists, real people have history. And Africa didn't have a history. And I joined the first Department of African History in the United Kingdom at SOAS under a very formidable man called Roland Oliver, who really carved out the subject in the UK. And at the time that I joined, the way in which people approached African history was really by saying, okay, we haven't got the written documents going right back. Though they're rather more than people anticipate. I mean, there are shipwreck records from the 16th century onwards. But, of course, that only touches the fringes of the continent. So it was at that time that I think African history was at its most pioneering and most interdisciplinary, because there was a recognition that to understand African history, you had to understand its archaeology and its oral traditions. The oral traditions only take you back at most 10 generations, but the archaeology can take you right back. In fact, archaeology can take you back to the origins of people in the continent and in the world for that matter. So archaeology is absolutely fundamental if you want to understand pre-colonial African history. And when I started out, most of my conversations were in fact with archaeologists, because that gave one a clue to the long history of African people, of all, and when I say African people, I mean people living in Africa, not only for hundreds of years, but thousands of years and hundreds of thousands of years. So that was a very exciting moment in African history. my task in teaching African history was I was responsible for teaching Southern African history, although in the beginning I also had to read right across Africa. Now today, that would be totally impossible. But when I started, the literature was so small that you could be expected to teach about the kingdoms in Mali in the medieval period, or the gold trade across the Sahara, or the Indonesian ships that were coming, and Indian ships and Arab ships that were coming to the east coast of Africa. So it was a very exciting period because we were breaking new ground all the time. When I was appointed, and I was still doing my PhD, I was appointed to do something which now sounds very quaint: African people and European rule in South Africa. Southern Africa, I think it was initially, and eventually that got too big and it became South Africa. And we taught that by using documents. So documents from the archives, documents, government papers, novels became documents, oral tradition written down, oral tradition, and very often oral tradition was written down in the 19th century, so you could get further back than just doing oral tradition in the middle of the 20th century. So we put together a course which was based on documents. In that case, it was relatively easy because the dates were 1890 to 1924. Out of that, I mean, beyond my teaching, and I had small children at that time, so teaching took a lot of time and children took a lot of time, particularly in Britain where there's not much help that you can get access to, and you can't actually get parking or go by car to work. So it was quite a difficult time. But by the end of the 1960s, I did what I suppose was my most exciting, but probably my most useful task. Not just writing my own history, but creating a seminar in London which attracted people who were working on South African history from all over Britain, but also from other parts of the world. And that was at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. I always had a foot both at SOAS and the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, partly for logistic reasons, but it suited me very well because people who didn't find me at SOAS thought I was at the Institute, and people who thought I was at the Institute, you know, I was in SOAS. So it was a very handy place to be at. And I was given a free rein over this seminar. The first seminar was very interesting. There were people, and it was on the societies of Southern Africa. And the first seminar, I remember at the end of 1969, we had a hall even more full than this, a room more full than this, sitting around the table, and I did exactly what Zaki did. I went round, because our speaker was late. Our speaker was a sociologist called John Rex, who was very well known, and lots of people had come to hear John Rex. John Rex hadn't appeared. So the only thing I could think of doing was to go around and ask everybody what they were doing. And I got to Lucy Mayer, which is, again, another familiar name for those who know African anthropology. She was the anthropologist of East Africa, and a very formidable woman. And we came to her, and she said, "I'm Lucy Mayer. I'm not coming to any more of these." And I think what she meant to say was that she'd only come to hear John Rex, and she really wasn't very interested in South Africa. But, you know, it was quite a daunting introduction for me as a very junior lecturer to running the seminar. But the seminar did thrive, and it had people giving papers to it whom most of you know, like Martin Legassic and Harold Walpe and so on. But it covered a very wide range. Unlike my course, which was 1890 to 1924, this was both interdisciplinary, so we had scholars, sociologists, anthropologists, historians, and geographers sometimes, people working in literature, and there was a real buzz about it. So that was probably, for me, the most exciting part of my career in London. But of course, in universities, you also have to teach and to publish. And the first sort of publication, I suppose, was that every year we edited and produced the collected seminar papers. And there were 20 volumes of those before I left the Institute, and we stopped publishing those collected seminar papers. I also published my thesis, which was, again, on a complete... And one of the things about my career, looking at it, I mean, people think I'm very focused because I work a lot. But actually, I'm focused on a lot of different things. And that, to me, is one of the wonders of history, that you never get bored, because there's always a question, and an important question, that you want to study. So my first book was my PhD thesis, and it was on an uprising in Natal against a poll tax, the Bambata Rebellion. And then there were collections of essays and chapters in the Cambridge History of Africa, and much more recently, of course, as you will know from those of you who were at the book launch recently, in the Oxford History, the Cambridge History of South Africa, which was a much more difficult task, and variety of other books and collections. Divided Sisterhood is one that might interest some of you. It was on the history of nursing in South Africa. And I had a wonderful experience at the book launch earlier this week, when a young woman came up to me and said, "I'm so pleased to meet you. My mother is the president of DENOSA, which is the Democratic Nurses South Africa." And she said, "And when we were little, she used to read chapters from Divided Sisterhood to you to us every night." And I thought, well, that's absolutely marvelous for me, but I don't know how marvelous it was for them. It was a great puff. But, you know, as I say, when you look at what I've published, even in the recent past, it is a bit crazy, especially as my memory is not as good as it was. So just in the past year, I've gone back to my interest in archaeology, and that's why there was that article in The Guardian, and published a long review article in African Studies at WITS on history and archaeology, because much to my delight, the wheel seems to have come full circle about archaeology. As I was saying, in the beginning, when I started, archaeology was very much in the forefront of African history, and I published a couple of articles then. To be involved in archaeology and oral history, you have to be in the place. And I was never in South Africa after 1960 doing African archaeology and oral tradition, although I was always in touch with the work that was going on. But some of my students were attracted to this, but I was reluctant to send people out into the field in apartheid South Africa, where you never knew what sort of access they'd have. So the theses I suggested for my graduate students always straddled the late pre-colonial and the colonial period, because then you knew that there would be enough material. And I had about 50 doctoral students in my time at SOAS, and some of them wrote very important books on the earlier history of South Africa, earlier 19th and 20th century history. 3 years ago, 2 of those former students who are now professors at WITS got money from the National Research Foundation to do something which we'd really encouraged in the early days, but it got sidetracked by all sorts of things, to bring historians and archaeologists together and to begin to push the frontiers again of that very early African history. And this has produced some absolutely astonishing results, which enable one to build up a very different picture of pre-colonial South Africa. And that's actually very exciting. If anybody's interested, I can go into some more of the detail. And recently, with Peter Delius at WITS, I've been editing a collection on history and archaeology in South Africa. And I think it's important to realize that having a sense of the long history of South Africa enables you to understand many of the complexities in present-day South Africa. That's, in a way, why I've spent my life in history. I mean, it has been a question of just understanding the way the country has evolved and the people have evolved and responded to the circumstances that they lived in. I've probably spoken enough. I just want to say one thing, that thinking about the title, Life in History, it occurred to me that the thing that really turns me on about history is lives in history. At a time when history, particularly of Southern Africa or South Africa, was dominated by the big theoretical propositions, I always felt that what was missing in that approach to history is what happens to ordinary people in history. Nobody's ordinary, I shouldn't even use the word, but do you know what I mean? Not people. The big noises, the people. So a lot of my work has been looking at, exploring the ways in which history shapes people and people shape history. And they're usually, or they're not particularly necessarily, the big names in history. So, for example, I think one of my favorite books is a collection of of letters which I found and edited between an African schoolgirl and a 74-year-old teacher at Natal University, and the first Zulu woman to train as a social worker. It was called Not Either an Experimental Doll. And it was an extraordinary, the reason why I'm interested in lives in history is because I think people are intrinsically interesting, but also because through those lives, if you approach it properly, you can actually understand far more about the dynamics of what's going on in a society. You start with the life, but the life can take you in all sorts of different connections and directions, I should say. So I've probably said enough. There's a lot more I could say, but, you know, a few scrappy notes.
Okay, so I want to thank Shula for that introduction. But there are many questions that all of us will have. And so the first question I want to say, I know you were born in 1939.
36.
36? Okay, 1936 Shula was born. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your forebears and how they came to South Africa, and particularly your mom and dad. I'm going to intersperse some of those things, some of the more historical questions, with that sort of history, if you don't mind.
Well, you talk... Can I sit? Or?
It's much better to sit.
Okay. Shout if my voice isn't carrying to the back of the room. I'm so pleased you asked that question, because one of the I have two projects on hand at the moment, and I've decided before my memory fails completely, I have to do a project I've been doing on what we call now community primary care, but used to be called social medicine. I'm not going to talk about that. I am going to talk about my second project, which is in line, a lot of research done, which I reckon I'll be able to do even when I have gone gaga, because it's about my parents.
Is that the only way one can discuss one's parents?
Well, that's a point. But you remember things backwards in time as you get older, and the learning new things, which I have to do all the time in the social medicine book, is actually getting harder and harder, because you have to check everything, and memory's not so great. But long-term memory is getting better. So that's a project for one's old age, and it's somewhat self-indulgent. That's why. Okay, so what is this project? When my mother died, aged 101, I might say, my brother and I found a little leather letter case in which she'd kept the letters of my father.
What was the name?
The name of my mother's name was Frida Sack. And my father's name was Hein Winneker. And these were the letters.
Sorry, we can't hear very well.
You can't. Oh, I better
Why
stand.
don't you bring your chairs closer?
Yeah?
There's some space
There's
here
some
in front.
spaces in front, and there's a space over there. Thanks. Okay. So I was saying, I found these letters between my mother, Frida Sack, and my father, Chaim Winnicker. I'll spell it for you afterwards. Which they wrote when, well, he wrote, most of the letters were from my father, and he was writing to my mother. And this was when they were courting. My mother, both my parents came from Lithuania. My mother arrived in this country in 1903 when she was 5. My father arrived in 1920 when he was 18. And it was a very odd match, actually, because my mother was very anglicized. She'd been to school in South Africa. She loved English poetry and English literature, and particularly romantic literature. And she was quite a formidable person in Johannesburg. She was very well known in the Jewish community. And my father, his education stopped when he was 12. He didn't have any education after the age of 12. And he spent the war years, he was really a street child, because he grew up in an area of Lithuania which was crisscrossed by armies during World War I between 1914 and 1918. And he was separated from his family. So, and I knew nothing about this when I was growing up. They never ever talked about the past. But in the letters, there's a very interesting and poignant letter from my father to my mother. And I must assume that she wrote the letter to which he was responding. And she must have written something like, I'm an independent, and she says this somewhere else, I'm a modern progressive woman, I'm independent, I'm used to supporting myself. She was already in her 30s, which then was quite late for a woman to get married. And she said, I'm not sure you're going to fit in with my friends. My friends play golf, and they play cricket, and they play football, and we go ballroom dancing, and, you know, you're really not going to fit in. He taught himself English by candlelight in little hotels in the Karoo. He'd, as I say, spent the war years running away from armies. At the end of the war, the family clearly met up again, and they decided that he should be sent to South Africa, where there was already an uncle. It's a very familiar story. He wasn't the oldest, but they reckoned he found out how to look after himself, and they could send him. He spent the next 10 years earning enough money as a commercial traveller in the Karoo to bring out his 3 sisters, 2 brothers, mother and father, and the spouses, the husband and wife of his oldest sister and oldest brother, and a 7-year-old child. There was one final brother left behind, and he managed to send him to study engineering in France. And that brother ended up literally electrifying Algiers, providing it with the first electricity. So you have one son, my father, whose education stopped, formal education stopped when he was 12. The other one is an electrical engineer who electrifies a big city. It's astonishing. My dad hated the Karoo. You must remember, he came from a part of Europe, northern Europe, with forests and lakes. In fact, I've just discovered exactly where he came from, and it was a very beautiful part in south of Latvia, on the borders of Lithuania. So he then goes on in the same letter to say, you don't know where I'm coming from, and he tells her the story. And then he says, I suppose if I'd have had the opportunity, I would have played cricket and golf as well as average. Football, I don't know. Imagine me, Chaim Winokur, breaking a man over a football. Chess was more his line. He then went on to say, as for dancing, 2 parts of it I know already. The turning round part and the sitting out part. And if you want me to learn the 3rd part, I'll do it for you. That was actually quite sad, because he thought she was calling the whole thing off. And I think that letter persuaded her not to call it off. But it was always, it was always a tension between her and particularly his family. The other thing that happened to the family was that his oldest siblings, his older sister and older brother, both got divorced when they came to South Africa. Now, that for the family was absolute disaster. My father almost didn't propose to my mother because he thought this was such a stain on the family's good name. It's hard for us to think about divorce that way now. But actually, there's a cousin of mine who doesn't want me to tell the story because it was her mother who got divorced in 1930. So it's extraordinary. So that's, if you want to know,
Now,
this is my project.
Your parents came from Lithuania.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the difficulties that Jewish people faced in Lithuania, in Russia, in the Russian Empire, and so on?
The first thing I should say is that Lithuania is a very slippery term. My mother said my father came from Lithuania. My father said he came from Russia. My 7-year-old cousin who came in 1930 said he came from Poland. And they were all right, because when my father was running away from the armies, Lithuania was part of Russia. When my mother got to know the story, it was Lithuania. In between, my cousin who was born there, that bit of Lithuania actually was taken over by Poland. And I then had so my father's family were effectively in Poland in the 1920s. Now, you ask about the circumstances which Jews faced. In the Russian Empire, as it then was, the Jews had a very hard time by the end of the 19th century. They suffered what were called pogroms, riots in which they were very often killed, anti-Semitic riots, very often fomented by the Russian government and monarchy itself, and many of them were extremely poor. This was not a wealthy community in Lithuania at all. And when my mother's father came to South Africa in 1898, he had never had a proper job in Lithuania. Came from a tiny village, unlike my father's family, came from a tiny village. And I never understood how it was possible that my mother would describe living in really very poverty-stricken circumstances in Potchefstroom. And yet the first family photograph I have, which is about 5 years after they arrived, maybe 7 years after they arrived, they all look beautifully dressed, and it's a real bourgeois photograph in that very short period of time. And for years I asked my mother, how did he make his living? How is it that you describe everything as being appallingly poor, and yet here is this very middle-class family? And she was well into her 90s, and she said to me, Ah, but he got the tender for the British Army in Potchefstroom to provide bread. He was told by somebody from the same village that there was a scope in Potchefstroom for a baker. So he became a baker. And my mother, they were an Orthodox Jewish family, but my grandfather sent the girls to a German Catholic convent. How did he do it? He paid them in bread. He provided the convent with bread and I think milk. They had cows as well. And that's how he got his children through school. So that was the situation in the 1890s, 1900s, and there was massive pogrom in Lithuania, 1905, and lots of Jews fled from that. A pogrom is a massacre, effectively, a xenophobic massacre, and people here know all about that. My father, as I say, came from really the borderlands of Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and very similar circumstances in Lithuania by the end of the war. When Lithuania became part of Poland, things got very much worse. I was absolutely shocked. Jewish community, the allocation of this chunk of Lithuania to Poland was done by the same treaty that ended World War I. The Jewish community were horrified at the thought of being pushed into Poland, and it was densely settled. That area was very densely settled by Jews. Most of them very poor. The legislation, when you read it, reads like apartheid legislation. It's quite uncanny. They were segregated, they wanted separate schools, but they weren't allowed to do particular trades, they weren't allowed to do different kinds of work, and they were squeezed, and there was an incredible amount of anti-Semitism. And that was before the Nazis invaded Eastern Europe. So they were fleeing persecution and poverty, essentially. And for them, South Africa seemed a golden opportunity, even if it meant, becoming a commercial traveller in the Karoo. So that's the story of how they got here.
Then you met Isaac Marx.
Yes.
Tell us about him.
He's not here to defend himself.
Did you write a letter to him saying, I'm a historian?
I married him before I was a historian. We married very, very young.
Where did you meet?
We met in Habonim, of course. Which is a Jewish youth movement, for those who don't know, but which has been quite connected to TAC at times.
And equal education.
And equal education, absolutely. So, among other things, I spent and didn't talk about my formative years were in Habonim. I learned my politics in Habonim. I learned to appreciate good music in Habonim. I learned to do all sorts of arts and crafts in Habonim. It was really a major part of our education. It was much easier, I think, for young Jewish people to be in a Zionist youth movement, which it was, in the early 1950s. And my parents were, in fact, both ardent Zionists, as most Jews were at that time. Coming from that background of incredible persecution, facing the disaster of the Holocaust with 5 million people massacred, at least 5 to 6 million people Eastern European Jewry was wiped out, virtually. Not totally, but virtually. And there was great euphoria about the foundation of the State of Israel. But Habonim always was not only a Zionist movement, though I think most of us had an idea of going to Israel, and I certainly thought I was on the way to Israel until 1967. Habonim was also a socialist movement, and we learnt our socialism in Habonim. In fact, many of my non-Jewish younger friends say that in the 70s, they used to go to Habonim meetings to find out what was happening in South Africa. So it always had a different take on what was happening here. And I learnt my commitment to the struggle in South Africa in the 1950s, partly through Habonim and partly through UCT, where I went to university. So we met in Habonim. I was in matric. He was a second-year medical student.
So he was your muddy?
No, he wasn't actually. But
counsellor.
Yeah, leader. Madrid guide. No, but we certainly knew one another at that stage, and that was a major area of socialization for young Jewish people as well.
So then in the now I want to talk about your work. When I grew up here and we were in the struggle, your ICS papers were one of the best things that educated all of us. I still have some of them stuck away in some place, maybe among
probably
these
quite
papers
valuable
here.
now.
So before you go, tell us, I want to ask you a favor to get the ICS to donate a full set to us.
Better still, they're being digitized. I just wrote the introduction to the digital whole archive.
But I'd like to have a printed set.
I don't think we've got the whole printed. I don't even think I've got the whole printed set. Or at least the first ones are all disintegrating. Can certainly see if there are any odd copies lurking, and I'm sure they'd be only too happy to send them because, once it's digitized, they'll have a full set and they'll have the digital thing.
So just before I go up, I'm just going to go up to 1967. When Shula says she was the last point that she thought of going to Israel. But before that, your work on the early labor movement and land and so on, but particularly what interested me at that time is I learned so much about the labor movement from people like Mark Stein who worked with you and so on. So could you tell us about the relationship between your work on land in South Africa and labor?
Yeah, I don't think you could escape working on land and labour if you were interested in the broad issues of South African history. I mean, they're absolutely fundamental. Reluctant Rebellion was absolutely located in the issues of land and labour, because you could only understand the Reluctant Rebellion, which, as I say, was over a poll tax which was imposed on Africans in Natal, KwaZulu and Natal, actually, by understanding what was happening to land, but also what was happening to labour. And similarly, I did a book on what I called the ambiguities of dependence in KwaZulu-Natal, where I looked at three leaders, John Dube, George Champion, and Gatsha Buthelezi, and that too drew me into the history of the struggle. I mean, on the one hand, the early ANC, on the other, the ICU, and finally what was going on at the time. And all that has to be rooted in the history of land and labour. But actually, as a study of labour in itself, I didn't really write about that. Of course, I taught about that, and I wrote about it in my big chapters for the Cambridge History of Africa, which I think was probably better than my chapters in the Cambridge History of South Africa, and was very much about, I mean, you couldn't write about that without looking at land and labour in the earlier period. But of course the seminar itself drew on the expertise of many people who were working on land and labour.
So I just wanted to go back to ambiguities of dependence. Your work on John Langalibalele Dube, the first ANC president, probably became the most influential understanding of the period then. And more recently, a book was published.
Heather Hughes on John Dube.
Yeah, First President,
yes.
Which is a book that is most amazing in its scope and what it says, but it draws heavily on your work. Do you want to, in this year of the centenary of the ANC, tell us a little bit about John Dube and also about Heather Hughes' book?
Yeah, well, Heather Hughes was a student of mine.
Exactly, that's why.
Not an accident. And she's been working on that book for a long time. And as you say, it is an amazing book. I think it's first rate. is really the best thing that's been written about John Dubé. She has managed to find evidence. I mean, it's been a life's work of hers. And she comes from Natal originally, and did a lot of oral research in KwaZulu-Natal. But she's also tracked down documents. I mean, John Dubé went to the United States, for instance, and I'd found some of those documents, but she has taken the story much, much further. So what can I say? I mean, you've got to read it. I was interested in the case of ambiguities of dependence. I mean, the title was very deliberately chosen because many people, whites thought that John Dubé was inciting the poll tax rebellion and regarded him as extremely dangerous, whereas later people looking at John Dubé's life and actions saw him as much more moderate than he should have been, and in fact, by the 1920s, he was really regarded as a very ambiguous, to use the phrase that I use, a very ambiguous customer, because he became increasingly close to the Zulu royal family and distanced from the labour movement and distanced from the ANC. I mean, there was always this tendency of KwaZulu-Natal taking off and going in its own direction. And so, although he was widely respected, of course, for his achievements, setting up the first Oklanga school, the African newspaper Ilanga Lazi Natal, becoming the first president of the ANC, and the first African to get an honorary degree from, I think, UNISA. No, not UNISA or Pretoria, I can't remember, but I mean, very surprising in the 1930s. He was a very ambiguous figure. And the argument in the book really is that in a colonial situation, people often have to face in different directions, and that this ambiguity was not accidental, it was almost structural in the situation. And that brings me to something else. One of the reasons that I like to explore things from the individual moving out, is because it's at that core that you begin to discover what I like to call ambiguity, the difficult choices that people make, but also the context in which they make those choices, which forces them to equivocate in a colonial situation.
So tell us about your children, and then your grandchildren as well, and then 1967.
Okay.
And then we'll open it up for people to ask questions.
I have two children. I have a son who's in his mid-40s, and he's an architect. He worked here for 8 years, and very much feels attached to South Africa. Both my children born in London. I have a daughter who's an historian, medical historian, and she is slightly older, Rafi's 47, she's 49. I have 3 grandchildren. Rafi has a daughter called Rosa, partly Rosa Luxemburg, partly Fairies at the End of the Garden. My daughter has 2 children, aged nearly 13 and nearly 10. And that's why I'm there and not here, I'm afraid. So that's the story.
But your daughter's name again?
Lara.
Lara.
My son's name is Rafi, Raphael, yeah. And she is a very fine medical historian. I mean, she wrote a book about the discovery and development of the contraceptive pill, and she's now writing about a history of monoclonal antibodies, and don't ask me to explain it to you, because I can't. But, yeah.
So, then you left South Africa, 67, so on?
I left South Africa 60. In fact, I left South Africa on the 31st of December 1959. I arrived in Europe in 1960. Yeah, a long time ago.
And 67? That 67, what?
Yeah.
What changed your life?
As I said earlier, I grew up in an intensely Zionist atmosphere. And both Isaac, my husband, and I thought we were on our way to Israel. And he wanted to specialize in the UK, so we went to the UK first, and that's when I went to SOAS and did my PhD and so on. So for a variety of reasons, we didn't go to Israel as we'd anticipated within a couple of years when he'd finished his studies at the Institute of Psychiatry. But we always intended to go. I mean, that was the sort of life plan. And then the 1967 war took place. And I think that war marked a real turning point in the history of Israel. I mean, it was the moment that Israel stopped from being a refuge for Jews and a place that they could feel safe in to becoming a colonial power in its own right. That it began to develop imperial tendencies of the land beyond the land allocated to it in 1948 by the partition of Israel and Palestine. And I suddenly realized, my God, here I am teaching about colonialism and decolonization. How can I participate in a movement like this? It was a very hard decision. My husband didn't agree with me at that time. We both had family in Israel. My mother, at the age of 74, up and often went to settle in Israel. So it was very difficult. But as things developed, even my brother, who lives in Israel, turned around, because we had a really serious split over this in '67. And by the late 70s, he was saying, you know something, I think you were right. But he's trapped there like many other people. So that's the story of '67 and why I belong to Jews for Justice for Palestinians, which is a very difficult thing to say in the Jewish community in this country, which is amazingly closed. I mean, minds closed to seeing what's really happening in the region, I think.
Okay, I'm going to open up for questions for people. Welcome to the colleagues and comrades who were late. And sorry, the mic is not here or on, so people might find it difficult to hear.
If you want me to call the questions, you'll have to summarize them, because
Okay,
I can't
yeah.
spin around.
Okay. Okay, can colleagues, I'm going to take an indication. Who wants to start off with some questions? Yeah.
I'm very interested in how we construct our identities and who we are. And especially, you've spoken a lot about a very strong, first was like a Zionist identity, then a strong then you kind of moved on from that. In the context of being like a South African with land ownership issues and all of that, where do you see a place for a South African identity, and how do we construct that? And I've got issues with having any type of identity like that, like a nationalist identity. I think it's a scourge. So, and I would like, my other question is, do you think there's any use in having a strong sense of like identity with like either being Jewish or South African or anything? Thank you very much.
Can you repeat?
I got that, yeah.
That's a really tough question. I think that we don't entirely choose our identities. You know, you get born into a family, you're born into a class, you're born into a particular situation, and that shapes the way your identity gets shaped. The degree of changing your identity, well, it's not open to everybody to change their identity quite so easily. For instance, Jews in Eastern Europe, or indeed in many other places, had no choice because they were labeled Jews and persecuted because they were Jews. Same thing happened in this country. People's identity was circumscribed in a sense. Having said that, I also don't think we have single identities. We have very contextual identities. You know, if I go and talk to my family, I have a different identity to the identity I have talking to you here, or the identity that I have as the director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. So I think we really, our identity is shifting in terms
of the Dame of the British
I'm not
Empire.
a Dame. I'm not.
Which one are you?
I'm Order of the British Empire, which I never use. It's an embarrassment. That is not my identity.
So when you talk to the Queen, you have a totally different identity.
I don't get to talking very much to the Queen. I'll tell you a wonderful story. When I was the director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, we celebrated our 40th anniversary. And the Queen, of course, is the head of the Commonwealth. Because the Institute was under fire in the university, for reasons I won't go into now, but Thatcherite reasons, we invited the Queen's secretary onto our, before I actually became the director, the Queen's secretary was on our board of management. And this was something of a protection for us, as was the fact that the Secretary General of the Commonwealth was also on the board. When we discussed in the council how we celebrate the 40th anniversary, the Queen's private secretary popped up and said, "I'm sure Her Majesty would be delighted to entertain a group from the Institute of Commonwealth Studies to commemorate this event." And I couldn't actually say, "I'm a Republican, we're not going to do this." So Muggins here took a coachload of assorted vice-chancellors, students at the Institute, lecturers at the Institute, Albie Sachs, who was doing research at the Institute at the time, and Mary the cleaning lady. And I had to take the Queen round and introduce her everybody to her. You're not allowed to talk to the Queen unless she talks to you first. And she was incredibly awkward. And, you know, you want to put her at ease, and you can't because you're not allowed to talk to her. So anyway, she went around looking so nervous and so uncomfortable. And, you know, we did the introductions. She didn't know who Albie Sachs was. She clearly was not terribly interested in everybody. I mean, she was out of her normal milieu. When she got Mary the cleaning lady, she was fine. She could do all the noblesse oblige stuff, and Mary the cleaning lady was absolutely delighted. So you don't have a conversation with the Queen. But it's not why I got the OBE.
I'd just like to know, what is your take on how history is sort of being currently taught at schools and at universities in South Africa? Is it, I know people often use the word like transformation in South Africa, is it in line with that agenda? Do you think it's on the right track?
Look,
I know it's a fairly broad question. I know
it's a big question, and it's one that worries me very seriously, because as the heading, which I didn't write to my article said, I said that people were very ignorant about the land question in this country. But I think it starts with the situation in the schools themselves and the teachers in the schools and the kind of schools. So it's one of a number of subjects where students aren't getting a fair deal in a large number of schools. Now that is very varied. When I come, I often get asked, a couple of times I've been asked to talk in schools, and that's because the teachers know something about South African historiography, the writing of South African history. But I think that the vast majority of kids aren't getting access to this. And in the 1990s, there was a flight from history for three reasons maybe. The first one was that the curriculum changed from having history as a separate subject which you had to do if you were going to become a teacher, to history being part of social studies. And the majority of people who'd been taught in the apartheid schools who'd been taught history really didn't want to do history. I mean, it was taught so appallingly badly. So there was a flight from history, and everybody was saying, it's the death of history in South Africa, and there's no more history, etc. Now, when Kara Asmal became Minister of Education, he had a passionate interest in history. And in fact, he came to London to celebrate the 40th anniversary, I think it was, of the anti-apartheid movement, just as he was appointed minister. And I nobbled him and said, do you realize what's happening to history? And he set up a commission to inquire into history. And it was a brilliant commission. The recommendations were way ahead of anything that you'd get in the UK at this time, or now even more so, of course, but that was already Thatcher. And many of us thought, at last there'll be a breakthrough. I don't see the breakthrough, and one of the reasons I wrote that piece in the Weekly Mail was that I was so disturbed, not just by Peter Mulder, what do you expect from the leader of the Freedom Front Plus, after all, but there was a discussion on SAFM a few days later, and I was just appalled, and it was on history, taking off from the same point, and I was appalled at the ignorance by people who phoned in on both sides, black, white, whatever, but also at the panelists themselves. I thought it was horrific. And the response, a couple of responses in the Mail and Guardian last week simply proved my point. No understanding of the long history of inhabitants in this country.